Welcome to the Human Operated Ransomware section of the Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architectures. My name is Mark Simos, Lead Cybersecurity Architect at Microsoft. Jim?
And I'm Jim Moeller. I'm a lead investigator with the Microsoft Detection and Response Team, which is our externally facing incident response organization.
So Jim, you want to lead us off?
Sure. When we discuss the evolution of human-operated ransomware, we've had ransomware for quite some period of time, but it was a little less professional. It was a little bit less organized. It tended to be smaller groups spamming the internet and catching as catch can individuals and trying to extort ransom from there. That really started to change as the tooling matured, and there was a realization amongst the attack groups that this was a somewhat profitable and relatively low-cost mechanism of attack. And it started out about 2013, we saw an uptick with CryptoLocker, and then we kind of calmed down. And then where it really hit the fan is where we saw the WannaCry, WannaCrypt, and Petya Not Petya, where really after those attacks, the tooling to perpetrate enterprise-scale ransomware events became somewhat commoditized. And you should be asking yourself, well, what changed between 10 years ago when really cyber attacks took an uptick, and we'll talk about that in a moment, to the switch from basically advanced persistent threats coming in, stealing data, selling the data on the secondary market, to this enterprise level ransomware. As Mark and I are going to talk about, the basic mechanisms of action and the core of what these attack groups are doing has not changed since the world of credential theft and credential theft mitigation came about 10 years ago. Mark and I have been dealing with this from day one. So we're getting a little sick of talking about it, but at the end of the day, as we're going to talk about, the basic mechanism of how they're doing what they're doing has remained unchanged. What's really changed here is the economics and the profitability of doing what they do, because the tooling has become commoditized and cheap. The profits and the scale at which they can do this is very large. So the more money they get in, the more they can grow their organizations to a level that I think Mark's talked about in the past of really being as well funded as some of the nation states and perpetrating these attacks just for the sheer volume of money coming in.
Yeah, when you're getting millions and tens of millions of dollars over the course of a couple weeks or a month, you can buy a 0-day off the dark markets for $1 million and know you'll get good return on investment off of it. So the economics of this space have really changed, and we're now dealing with, at the time of recording, what I feel is the beginning of sort of a next generation of these attacks where the profits are so big that the ability for them to act, at least the funding ability for them to act at the level of nation states, for these criminal activities is right there. So it's a really scary change. So kind of talking about the implications of this. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. Historically, per computer, limited impact kind of things, just general attacks, stealing data, stealing bank accounts, et cetera, one at a time was kind of where security began. And then as Jim mentioned, about 10 years ago, we saw this explosion in target data theft when, things like the original Windows credential editor, the pass the hash toolkit that preceded it, soon became overtaken by Mimikatz, was just a normal part of data theft attacks. But originally nation states, but it's become more and more used in other attacks as well. And these kind of took you from a per computer to an enterprise-wide impact. That's what changed the scope of attacks. What happened next was, around that 2013 timeframe with CryptoLocker, they finally, found a way to do ransomware, which has its origins in like the 80s and 90s for extortion, but it didn't really become a big scale thing until that 2013 CryptoLocker, where they encrypted files, with the attacker keys. That was sort of a new innovation, as it were. And so that stopping of business operations, stopping and preventing people, the legitimate owners, from using stuff, that was sort of that piece. The problem we have now, especially in this latest iteration, is the combination of these two factors, the ability to have an enterprise-wide impact and stop operations. And this is where we start to see headlines. We could cite the current ones now, but by the time you watch this video, there might be newer ones. And there's a steady drumbeat of organizations whose operations, their business operations, are ground to a halt. And so the business impact of this is huge. The second piece, as we mentioned earlier, it's profitable, and that profit goes into the R&D. It goes into buying zero days and buying other techniques, and there's a lot of things that they can do with that money and research and whatnot. And so you see this, building on itself kind of momentum. And unfortunately, there's room to grow. When you look at your average everyday enterprise that's been around and operating for anywhere between 20 and 100 or 200 years, depending on the organization, they made IT decisions for the past 20, 30, 40 years without security as a top priority. And so a lot of systems were built without thinking of security or thinking of an earlier version of security, an earlier set of knowledge and wisdom on security. So you have all of these legacy decisions, this technical debt that has to be paid down. And the attackers can freely go in and find unpatched machines where there's not a good process to patch them, weak configurations, lots and lots of opportunity for these attackers to go ahead and take advantage of this. And again, a lot of organizations aren't mitigating credential theft as well. So this is also creating a lot of opportunity for these attackers to really operate effectively. And so highly profitable, relatively easy, depends on the organization's defenses. And we're just seeing more and more of this, and we don't expect this to stop anytime soon. So it's something we sort of have to expect as security professionals and just deal with it. So the governments are working together. They're putting pressure on in all the right places, but it's still going to take time to build a full end-to-end jurisprudence where you can prosecute and put attackers in jail from across borders anywhere on the internet. It's going to take a very long time for those kind of things to come in place. So we have to deal with this as best we can in the meantime. Jim, anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, and the other thing we need to understand is they are maturing their techniques to invoke additional profitability. So for example, it used to be, I'm just going to crypto locker you and you can't use your stuff, and that's going to motivate you to pay me. And that gave a certain percentage of victims would pay with that kind of motivation. But then what they discovered is, hey, you know what? With the access that I have before I do the ransomware and I take your operation down, I'm going to go ahead and steal a bunch of data, and then I'm going to use that data as an extra incentive for you to pay. So the extortion part of it. And if you don't pay, you know what? I didn't make money on the ransomware part of it, but I'm going to still try to make money on selling your data on the dark web. So they've really optimized several revenue streams out of one attack.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, they do a lot of other things with the data as well, which is, if the organization and they're, basically saying, hey, listen, we can't afford that, we can't pay. We've seen the ransomware actors communicate back and say, here's your balance sheet. Yes, you can afford it. We've seen them researching how much cyber insurance they have so they know how much to demand. There's a lot of really sophisticated things going out as they kind of hone their business model, their illicit, illegal business model. So these attackers are increasing in sophistication, kind of week over week, attack over attack as well. So there may be things that by the time you see this video that we haven't even yet seen. So let's actually jump into the attacks themselves. So Jim, do you want to kind of guide us through a flow here?
Yeah, so once again, the attacks have not really changed that much in the last year. The primary two mechanisms that attackers gain entry into environments have been relatively consistent for the last 10 years. Number one, spear phishing. I'm going to do open source intelligence on your organization, learn as much as I can about you, and I will be able to craft a fairly convincing email where somebody's going to click the link, somebody's going to open the document, and you're going to have a compromised endpoint in the environment. Or I have vulnerable or unpatched or exposed services on your network edge, if you will, that you're not really paying that much attention to, that the attackers can come in through RDP or other mechanisms or or a VPN vulnerability. So really the two main mechanisms that they're using to come in are classic spear phishing and looking for weaknesses on your edge, not physical networking weaknesses. The days of perimeter network attack is relatively gone. Everybody, even if you're incompetent, you can competently deal with perimeter security, because we've been doing it, as Mark said, for 30 or 40 years. It's the services and software you're exposing at that edge that's really leaving you opportunities for them to come in. But that's not really the problem. We have to expect attackers are going to get into your environment. You are going to lose endpoints to attackers. You are going to lose a service on your cloud or your network perimeter. It's what happens next that's the problem. It's what
before we move on to the next stage, I want to kind of highlight a couple things. One, we're not saying take down your edge firewalls, right? Like,
of course.
Well, there's still plenty of scans going on for low-grade stuff, right? So we wouldn't say tear it down, but would you bet your security posture on that? No. So that's a kind of a key nuance there. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, because of the profit model of this, we're starting to see essentially an elevation of risk. So someone that has like a commodity botnet that was normally just doing phishing and some low-level commodity types of attacks, we're starting to see them realize that, hey, I'm in this particular organization, right? Because they haven't gotten around to cleaning those low-grade attacks yet. I can resell my access to these ransomware groups, and they'll pay me, $10,000, $20,000, whatever it happens to be. And then they're going to turn into millions, which isn't my thing, but I'll sell it to them and I'll make extra money that I never expected, right? And so what the SOC has been ignoring, or security operations may have been ignoring as low-grade attacks, all of a sudden become existential attacks, like major breaches. So the profit level of this is also changing some of the dynamics and the assumptions that we're used to. So Jim, you ready for the next stage?
Sure. So once the attackers are in your environment, which once again, we have to accept that this is going to happen. It's what can the attackers do once they're in? Everybody's going to be able to do, no matter what you do, is now I'm an authenticated user in the environment. What can I do with authenticated user? I get much better visibility to your directory services, and it gives me much more information to plot my attack strategy. How am I going to get now from normal user to a level of access where I can actually install my tools and perpetrate my end target goals? So normally what happens is they learn enough about the environment, they know what groups, where the groups are, where administrative credentials are getting exposed, and they work on putting their tooling, their malware and tooling, into places where they're going to have the best chance of capturing administrative credentials that are being used too much, quite frankly. This is still a problem that we have been preaching and addressing for the last 10 years of be very careful and follow credential theft mitigation guidance, even with things like service accounts and things that may not be actual users. And it's hard. It can be hard, but we had a lot of time to do it. In organizations that are not doing this, the attackers can't do what they do unless they capture a level of access that allows them to deploy their ransomware, to steal the data. So at some point along the way, no matter how they got in, because we're seeing a little bit of innovation there with the supply chain attacks and other sorts of mechanisms for getting in, but even how they've been maturing in that regard, if credentials are being protected in a way that precludes them from capturing them and moving forward with their goals, that's where it would end. They get whatever they get with that endpoint or that server or that service that they enter in on, and that's the end of it. But that's not the end of it, because for the majority of the cases, they are able to parlay that access into a wider attack net, which allows them to capture administrative credentials. And at that point, they do whatever they do. In the olden days, it was steal data, stay quiet, and sell that on the secondary market, or if I'm a nation state, for my own intelligence goals or intellectual property capture goals. But today, it's I'm going to steal data for extortion, and I'm going to deploy my ransomware tool set to gain positive control of your environment. So once again, credential theft is still at the center of this. It's just the end objective, what they're doing with that access, that's really changed to great effect, because they've really made efficiencies in the way they do it, lowered their costs, and increased their profitability on it.
And this is where that sort of experience and sophistication, the business model kicks in, because the attackers, they know to go after the backups. They find the backups, they take them away. They know that if you're going to rebuild the environment, that you're absolutely going to need your network diagrams and some other artifacts. They go after that. And they know that they might be able to make some money off of you later, even if you don't pay or after you pay. So we see a lot of flexibility here where they're, one for that initial attack of I'll extort by, threatening to disclose, or I will, lock up your data so that you have to pay me to get back to your systems. So we see a lot of really just sophistication in how they're approaching this space. And the key thing to keep in mind, as Jim said a number of times, this looks, and up until that last point, like any other type of cyber attack, right? Because they don't care. Their objective is to get you to pay them, through those monetization schemes. So they will use any way to get around, any way of getting around the environment. Credential theft just being, such a reliable technique for them. And then getting to that last piece. So let's talk a little bit more on the solution side now. So just kind of summarizing, from that key takeaways, changes, the stakes are changed, no end in sight, and the attacks. Now this is where the good news starts. There's not a lot of good news, but there is some good news. These attacks have really two weaknesses that we've identified. The first is that they need to make sure, as Jim said, they need to be able to get broad access to make it a compelling reason for you to pay them, right? So they have to have those privileged access. The other one, and this is super important, on that one half of the extortion, the ransomware half of the extortion, which is they need to be able to encrypt the data in such a way that the only way you get your data back is to pay them. They have to be that single source of getting your data back. So if you have good immutable backups, whether it's offline physical backups or it's immutable storage in Azure or some other cloud service, it's important to have a set of backups that the attacker cannot alter. And that will stop the ransomware. You have to pay the ransomware aspect because you don't have to pay the payment to restore. Now, it's still painful, right? If you've got to restore a whole bunch of systems and get business operations up, you still need a good plan. And we'll talk about that in the last slide and as an example in a moment. But this is a major important thing to focus on so that you actually have an option to get your data and your systems back without having to pay the adversaries. And so those are the two weaknesses that we've identified that you can focus on for prioritizing your mitigations. And so we have a full set of documentation, and we'll show you an example in the next slide here before we close out. And this is an end-to-end plan that looks at all the different aspects, the endpoint, the identity, the backups, the security operations, the privilege access piece. And so making sure that you've got the most resilient security stance that you can to the attacks. And so that's really what we're focused on there. And it's really oriented around kind of those 1, 2, and 3. The first one is getting a backup and making sure that that backup works, making sure that, hey, we can restore these servers at however many an hour, however many a day. Great. How many servers do you have? Can you actually do that in the space of a day or 2 or 3 that the business would want to get back up and running? If not, start thinking about your plan. So, the key is to make sure that you have an end-to-end, it will actually work in a crisis type of plan for your backups, as well as obviously the files themselves. Second priority, reiterating what Jim said, protecting those admins, making sure that your privilege access is in a good place where your admins are really hard to reach for those attackers, where they'll be detected or they will be blocked before they get it or right after they get it, so that you can respond and cut them off before they actually do damage to your organization, your operations. Super important to focus on those two priorities first, and then look for low-hanging fruit. Look for other things you can do for all of that variety of attacks they could bring in, through the unpatched systems, patch them. Through the phishing emails, make sure you have good detection and response in place to deal with those, as well as prevention and filtering. Really the rest of the security aspects of your environment kind of come next based on where you are in your maturity for various different capabilities. Jim, anything to add before we kind of show an example plan there?
Yeah, I always like to quote our own CISO, Brett Arsenault, on how we protect Microsoft being a three-pronged strategy, or as he says, a three-legged stool, where if you take away any of those three legs, of course, the stool is going to tip over. Number one, protect identity, especially administrative identity, but then even all the way down to the end users, bolstering identity protections for users as well. Number two, deal with your data. The backups, as you said, and not treating all your data equally, giving priority to that data that is mission critical and critical to your business or will be damaging if lost. And number three, quite frankly, patch your stuff. Because realistically, there is a delta between when us and third-party vendors release critical security patches and those critical security patches get installed. The time it takes for attackers to weaponize those has shrunk dramatically. So a 30, 60, 90-day patch cycle is way, way more time than attackers need to reverse engineer and actually weaponize and start deploying the vulnerabilities addressed by those patches. So quick and efficient patching, especially of critical security patching, is absolutely key of both our stuff and third-party stuff.
Yeah, and the way I like to think about the patching is it's not as hard as IT says it is, but it's not as easy as IT security thinks it is. And so there is a truth in the middle, and you've got to do your best to work on those critical assets, those internet exposed ones first. And that kind of guidance is what you're going to find in those plans. So let's take a look at an example of one of those plans, because we built about 8 or 10 of these, if I recall correctly, to help organizations really plan and execute well and quickly on protecting from ransomware. First we start with the what. What is the desired outcome? This is in the case of backup and making sure they're protected against those erasure and encryption of the backups. Why is this important? So you can explain it and balance it among the others within your team. Again, this is the one that we picked on purpose. That is one of the most important. Then how to do it. What is your checklist? What are the things you need to do to make sure that you're in good shape, that you have the ability to do this, the supporting documents, the process, and that you have strong protection or the strongest protection for these. And then who? This is one of the things that we find challenges a lot of organizations when they're trying to do something quickly, is who needs to be involved? Who's the one that has to sponsor this? Who's typically a project leader that's going to lead this and kind of herd all the cats and make sure that people are doing their pieces and parts to it? And then, of course, what are the team members that need to bring in expertise and administrative rights and access to these systems to make this a reality? And so we really wanted to make that as easy as possible for you to plan it and execute on it as quickly as possible, and then measure. If you look at like the what and then the measuring at the very top and the very bottom, that's really an OKR, an objective and key results. What are we doing? What are we measuring it? And then how do you do it in the middle? And so we identified that, so you can pretty much use this as your project plan, get started, put the slide up, edit it into real time in a team meeting, and then start working on it and protect your environment. So each of those, we've got about 8 or 10 of these plans, as I mentioned, to help you get started. And so we really feel this is super urgent, and we would want you to protect yourselves as fast as possible, not only in backups, but in all the other elements as well. Jim, any final thoughts before we close out?
Absolutely lean on these resources that we have been producing and giving. We are trying our best to keep these as up to date as possible with the current threat landscape as it happens. But I think we are producing some fairly comprehensive, checklist-oriented things that you can start doing today.
Jim, thank you. And all of you, thank you for listening and watching. And good luck out there.